So just for those of you who might be new to our Lunch and Learns with Plastic Free Delaware, we are the statewide nonprofit that is dedicated to trying to reduce plastic pollution in the state. And we've also sort of expanded our mission to one of fostering zero waste. So we are expanding our programs and our outreach and everything to sort of encompass everything zero waste and trying to reduce what goes to the landfill. So actually that's a perfect segue to Nivette and Sarah, who represent two estuary organizations in Delaware. Nivette is with the Center for the Inland Bays, and Sarah is with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and which I actually worked there for a little while, which is how I was familiar with the shell recycling program that the partnership started. And it's just kind of a cool thing. I've always thought it would make a fun lunch and learn. It is, it is definitely keeping tons of weight out of the and material out of the landfill. So we love that, anything that accomplishes that. And so I guess without further ado, I'll just turn things over to Sarah first and let her tell us about her program, and then Nivette, and then we'll do, just informal Q&A at the end. Okay, it's all yours, Sarah.
Thank you. Thanks, Dee, and thanks for having me today. Happy to participate. Let me pull up my screen here. Can you all see that, my presentation? Okay. As Dee said, I'm Sarah Bouboulis. I'm the Habitat Project Coordinator for the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and I do many things there, but we're going to focus on our oyster shell recycling program today that I mostly manage the kind of day-to-day operations of. I'm going to start just telling you a little bit about the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary and why we're interested in shell recycling at all. As Dee mentioned, we're a national estuary program, which is one of 28 around the country. CIB that Nivette is with is another one. And we cover kind of a large geographic area that covers the pretty much total whole lower portion of the Delaware River Basin in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, but we're working towards clean water goals throughout the entire estuary. And we are generally guided by what's called a comprehensive conservation and management plan, which kind of focuses on the three areas on the left there: clean waters, strong communities, and healthy habitats. And as I go through kind of the rest of my presentation today, you'll see that oyster shell recycling really helps us hit a lot of goals and strategies in all three of these kind of areas. Oysters are amazing filter feeders for clean water, and we'll get into more of that a lot, and obviously healthy habitats throughout the estuary where oyster reefs are located. So it just covers many bases, and we saw this as a need in our area and really how we got started. But for anyone who's unfamiliar with, we'll start with the really basics here. I'm going to go over kind of nuts and bolts of oysters and oyster life cycles, and then a little bit about our program in particular and what we're doing. But if you don't know, oysters are bivalve shellfish, which means they have two shells. There are many, many types of bivalve shellfish. They live in fresh waters, up in the Delaware, tributaries, all the way to marine environments. Oysters are obviously one marine species. We only have one species of oyster on the East Coast here, the eastern oyster. There are other species of oysters around the country and around the world. You may be most familiar with them as a popular seafood item on menus, on the half shell or in other dishes. I don't really like them, but lots of people do. They're very good. They've been a food source to indigenous people for a very long time. Throughout, very, very popular in colonial times. They've been a food source for forever. They're also filter feeders, which means they have kind of a siphon in which they take in water. They're able to kind of sort what comes in and take food out of that. And then they're able to get rid of all the other stuff and they kind of take it out of the water column and put it more into the sediment and things like that, what they don't eat. They also grow in reefs, which are like large conglomerations of oysters kind of all stuck together. That's kind of their natural habit. They can grow both subtidally and intertidally. So that means subtidal, they're completely covered by water all day. Intertidal, they will be exposed during low tides. We are kind of at the northern range of where they grow intertidally. They need it to be pretty warm. They don't do well in ice. So, but we are. The Delaware Bay, there are some intertidal oyster reefs. We're going to go through the life cycle and then how the recycling kind of enters the oyster life cycle. At the bottom here, we have our adult oysters that grow in these really large reefs. Oysters are broadcast spawners, which means you have a male oyster, female oyster. They both release their separate gametes into the water. They meet within the water column, and they have a floating or a mobile larval stage, kind of two different stages that float around in the water column, make up the zooplankton, that sort of stuff for a, how long it actually lasts depends a little bit. But eventually they will become more of a shell. They will grow a small one shell, and then they need to find something to attach to. And that is called a spat. Usually, or their favorite thing to attach to is other oysters, particularly the oysters that are already existing kind of in these reefs. They will attach to many, many other things, rocks, wood, the toilets in the water, lots of other things they will attach to, but their natural thing and the thing that they do have an affinity for is other oyster shell. We come into this cycle as we remove oysters from their reefs or other ways and bring them in as a food source. So we're removing kind of the adults from this life cycle and eating them, and then not eating the shells, and you just eat the muscle and all that stuff that's inside the shell, obviously. And most of those shells in most places end up in the trash. And they're very heavy, as Dee said, so they add a lot of weight to your trash and things like that. So we want to stop that. So we enter our recycling process, where we're taking the shells from where they are consumed and getting them back into our area waterways, where they can support the oyster populations. Recycling is good. So mentioned a little bit, obviously, but we'll go over a little more about the general benefits of getting these shells and therefore more oysters back into our waterways. They obviously help bolster the oyster populations by providing that substrate that the baby oysters can then attach to. You're creating hopefully these larger reefs where they can find a place to grow. You're providing habitat not just for the oysters, but tons of other marine life as well. I like to make a comparison. I like to call oyster reefs kind of the coral reef of the north, because they are, as you know, coral reefs are home to so much of sea life, and so is the oyster reef, just of a different kind here in our more northern regions. But so many invertebrates, fish are feeding around and on oyster reefs. There's just so much life that is happening on these oyster reefs. They also provide water quality uplift via their filtration capacity. So when they're pulling things out of the water column, they are obviously using some nutrients as part of their function, but they're also pulling other pollutants and things out of the water column as well. They can help buffer water pH due to the calcium and things that are in their shells. And they can help with shoreline stabilization when used in kind of a very specific function, as we kind of do with kind of our living shoreline operations. But also if you're doing more reef building, reefs do provide natural wave attenuation. They slow down waves from hitting shorelines. and kind of a natural way to kind of reduce erosion. So they can do that both naturally or kind of in a living shoreline situation, which we'll get a little more into. Sorry. This is our general recycling process overview, and I'm going to go through each of the steps that we do to get these shells back into the water. There's eating, there's the collecting of the shells, the curing of the shells, general processing of the shells, and eventually our reuse of the shells. First is the eating. This is a nice plate of oysters from Trolley Square Oyster House in Wilmington. So we started our oyster shell recycling in 2016, and we are currently only PDE. Nivette will talk about her more down south, but we are only in northern Newcastle County at this time, and we would love to expand, and we do have plans to expand to Philly, but the startup operations of oyster shell recycling are kind of tricky. You really need a large space with which to cure the shells, which I'll show you in a minute, and finding that, particularly in urban areas, can be where people are eating. You want to be close to where the shell is being produced, can be a little tricky, so that takes time. And then funding the collections, getting funding for that is also tricky. So finding those two things, a space and funding in the same area, proved to be a challenge, but we eventually found that in Wilmington, luckily, because that's right near where our offices are based as well. And we are currently collecting from 6 restaurants in Newcastle County. And, you know, we want the most bang for our buck as far as our collections go. So this really does make up the bulk of oyster shell that is probably being created in northern Newcastle County. There are certainly other restaurants that have shells occasionally, but they're going to be a smaller amount. And we have worked with some of them in the past, and we do have a public drop-off site where some other smaller restaurants can drop off smaller amounts of shell. But these are our restaurants that we currently collect from. Trolley Square Oyster House is in Wilmington. They're our biggest producer. We also have Banks Seafood and Columbus Inn in Wilmington. George & Sons is a market in Hockessin. They're our second biggest producer. And that's where we also have our public drop-off location. So if you have oysters or an oyster bake at home, or like I said, we have some smaller restaurants that will drop off there, you can go to George & Sons and drop them off in their bins, which it depends, you know, we only currently have that one that was interested in having the public come and drop them off. But we have Blue Crab in Backburners also in Hockessin, and the Blue Crab Grill is in Newark. We usually have these big bins at most of our restaurants, depending on the volume that they create, and we collect them. Depends on the season, how often we're collecting them, weekly to bi-weekly. We've collected over 5,600 bushels of shell since we started, which is over 140 tons of shell. We were doing about 110 bushels a month before COVID, and now we're at about 75 bushels a month. A few restaurants that we were going to did close down in the pandemic. So that was sad, but that's kind of where we are now. You can see this is our monthly collections on the side there in bushels. It's a little higher in the summer, but it's really pretty consistent all year for our area. Then we take the shells back to our shell management area, curing area. And honestly, this whole process is a natural process. We just use the sun and the bugs and the natural bacteria to get all the goop and other foodstuffs that was on the shell. It bakes it off pretty much, and they become kind of an inert shell at that point. We don't want oyster diseases, human diseases, anything like that going back into our waterways. So we have that. We make sure they're cured. It's for at least 6 months that they sit and are cured, and turning them as frequently as we can to kind of keep them aerated and things like that. After that, we need to sort of process them to get them in a way that we can use them for our projects. That's primarily putting them in bags that makes them easier to move around and for use in some different sorts of projects. This is our biggest labor of the whole process, is getting them into these bags. We kind of have this machine we use. They go over the machine onto our what we call shell tables, where we kind of shake them around and get them into these tubes and then into the bags, if that's what we're doing. Sometimes depending on the project, you can do it other ways, but we use a lot of volunteers for this. This is our, even as an organization, is our biggest volunteer opportunity. We need groups of people, about 10 or so, to come help bag up during different seasons of the year. Here's on top of the table. And then there's us. We're so happy with our, it's a group effort for sure. We've had way over 100 volunteers at this point helping with this, many volunteer hours. We've bagged over 12,000 bags since we've started, and that doesn't include shell that we haven't bagged, which could help to stabilize over 4,000 feet of shoreline, and lots of help from PDE staff too. And so once it's more processed in a form that we can do, we reuse it. And personally, in our living shoreline project, PDE does a lot of our own living shoreline projects, which are kind of that shoreline stabilization and reef building of these intertidal oyster reefs, excuse me, that I was talking about. And but we also sell and give shell to other restoration groups as well, who are doing projects throughout the region. So we've used shell in all 3 states for all sort of different projects. And I think we're not gonna go too much into that now. Nivette might talk a little more about that. So that's it for my portion. I'm gonna throw it over to Nivette now. This is my contact information if you wanna reach out, particularly if you're interested in volunteering. We're always looking for more volunteers to help with our bagging, so feel free to reach out. And I think that's it for me. I'll send it over to Nivette next. I think we're gonna wait for questions till the end. Stop sharing. Go ahead, Nivette.
I forgot I was muted, sorry. Can you see the full screen or just seeing a part of it? There we go.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Nivette Perez. Can you hear me well? I'm in a closed room and I feel myself with an echo. As I was introduced by Dee, I'm the project manager for the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays. Oh, this is moving by itself. I'm so sorry about that. So the Delaware Center for the Inland Bays is, as Sarah mentioned, a private nonprofit. It was actually in 1988 designated by Congress that the inland bays were an estuary of national importance. And based on this, it became in 1994 by an act of Delaware legislature into a national estuary program. And there's 28 nationally, so Delaware is very special that we actually have 2. And that means our waterways is very intrinsic to the culture within Delaware. Our mission is to preserve, protect, and restore Delaware's inland bays and their watershed. So this means it's not just the water within the inland bays. It also includes, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this is Rehoboth Bay, Indian River Bay, and Little Assawoman Bay. And we are not just protecting and trying to restore habitats within the waterways, but also anything that is within the watershed, which, if you can see, goes all the way from Cape and Lupin and Lewis to Georgetown and all the way to Fenwick Island. So it is a pretty big piece of land that is basically in connection with the inland bays. The bays itself are pretty shallow. We normally tell people if they fall in the water, try to stand up because they're between 4.5 to 5 feet deep normally, so they're not that deep. And something important about estuaries is that they support fish and shellfish species when they're most vulnerable, when they're normally in their juvenile larva stages, when they're babies. So they're considered the nurseries of our oceans. So it is very important to protect them, because if not, that could have a ripple effect into our fisheries and other habitat consequences later on. So the Don't Check Your Shell program, I kind of skip a little bit. Sarah and I were in contact, and she did a great job talking about the introduction about the oysters. I will talk a little more about our project, and then I would like to talk about how we actually get the live oysters back into our waterways. So, and at the center in Sussex County, we actually started the program in 2014. And it's like Sarah mentioned, the recycling program where we are diverting tons and tons of shells, spent shell from restaurants, from the landfill, trying to putting them back in restoration projects in the bays. And this is one of I would say several projects in the center that are trying to facilitate and bring back the Eastern oyster to the inland bays. So these are our, this is our logo for our program, and these are our partner restaurants. And as you can see, they are all the way from the top to the bottom of our watershed. And we are starting to expand. This one here is Baywood, I think, and is our newest restaurant. And we're trying to expand. This is limited by basically staff. We have one dedicated Don't Check Your Shuck assistant that does rounds during the year, and anything west from the Route 1 during the summer is very difficult to do in a day, just because of the density of traffic in the area. So we are working, we definitely want to expand, but right now we're just limited by how much, by the time of our staff to actually do the runs. These are over 20 restaurants. I think we actually have 23 partner restaurants, and these are some of them. Many of them are part of the Sodell group. Some other are independent, and excuse me, all of them, these are the ones that basically serve oysters throughout the year. We also have other partners that just serve oysters in just specific months, and we also collect those shell when they ask us to help them. Why shellfish is important, as Sarah mentioned, other organisms love it. They provide a 3D structure, they provide protection, they provide a surface for them to lay their eggs, or for algae to grow, or for other organisms to eat. And this supports populations of blue crabs, shrimp, other fish species. And at the same time, we know that oysters have amazing filtration capabilities and help our water quality, water quality in our bays. Like, it basically kind of goes the same way. You can help us eating and volunteering, and as easy as visiting some of our partner restaurants and having some of our shellfish. And this one I want to mention is not just oyster shells. We also collect clams and mussel shells, and they're all together in the piles. Here is our previous Don't Check Your Shuck assistant. After one of his runs, he's dumping the shell into the pile. And if you can notice here, this shell has like a lot of different colors. There's still some lemons in there. There's different shell. And then if you look at the pile over here, it looks like snowy white. It's so nice and clean because this one has been here for longer. Then the process of packing them, we don't have, like Sarah showed that kind of ladder that push the shell. We use a tractor, and we dump the shell in our table, and we pack it on the different bags with shovels. And we use volunteers, and we try to we try to work with our partner restaurants to do our bagging events, just to bring them back and to create awareness on them, like, hey, this is where the shell that you put every day separate. This is what we're asking you to separate them from the rest of the trash. This is what we're doing with them. But lately, we'll be moving out. The center has been trying to move away from those plastic bags to use a different material for packing, because the concern is you use the bags for bringing them to do construction or restoration projects in the base, but that bag is plastic. So we've been moving away from that a little bit, and we're using this material here is a coconut fiber material. So it's organic, not organic, but it's something that will deteriorate and is natural. Here are some of our volunteers bagging them. They're kind of different. You put a couple shovels of oysters in the oyster shell in there. Then you kind of sew them together with rope, and you do these long kind of cylinders, and that's what we will use to do our restoration projects. And you can see the other ones that we have previously packed in the bag and the new ones. Another advantage of this is you can cut them in different sizes and do different shapes that with the little ones is not possible. And this is all done by volunteers, like I mentioned, and it's a hard work. Like you can say, Andy works now for us, and he's our one of our shellfish assistants, and you can see it. You sweat, and it was cold that day outside, and we were all sweating. I was not in the picture. I took the picture. So by the numbers, the program is doing extremely well. We do have collected over 24,000 bushels since the inception of the program to 2021. That is over 759 tons diverted from the landfill. 62 bushels a month is our average, around 2 tons. And that varies because if you see here a typical year for us, normally Sussex County and mostly our areas around the beaches, there's certain restaurants that close during the winter, but also we have less people going to the restaurants. So in January, February, March, we collect shell once a week, and then we start collecting more often because they fill up the collection of trash cans or buckets faster. And then in October, November, December, we kind of go back into ones. These tables actually showing the average, so it's not kind to take care of the exaggeration of the 2 pickups a day. So, but still with the average, you can see that during those months, we have a little higher. Definitely in July and August is our highest collection months. And this is when we start listening from them, like, hey, it's full, can you come today? And we need to do an extra special run for that. Over 3,200 shell bags we have produced, and all of these are already predetermined to be used one way and another in restoration programs. So something I want to talk about is the connection of our recycle program and how we bring back oysters into the inland base. In our case, yes, you will get some natural deposition and some natural recruitment of oysters, but we try to do give it a little kickstart. And that's when our oyster gardening program comes into place. We buy oyster larvae. This little blob that you see here is 1 million oyster larvae, and they're in the free floating form. So we will stack shell bags in a tank, fill up the tank, and put the shell in there, and the larvae in there, and we will leave it at least a week or two for them to transition from larvae, free swimming larvae, to spat. And I have a little video of how they actually look when they're free floating. So this is how they look under the microscope, and you can see even in the little stages, they're already like filter feeding and moving around and getting some food inside of them. So even when they're little, they're already filter feeding. And now I just want, if people could in their chat box tell me how many spat do you see? So spat are the little larvae attached to this shell. Do you see any of them? So to give you an idea, this is one. This is just after setting. And just to give you an idea, these are all little now spat that has already attached to that shell. So with time, these will grow to be adult oysters now. So our oyster gardeners, we deliver those baby spat and we put them in these little baskets. And after a year, they will grow to be bigger. And I don't know if you can see them here, but these ones sticking out in here, these wider ones that are smaller, those are the actual new juvenile oysters. And after a couple of years, they actually start creating these clumps of live oysters that are what we need and we like for our restoration projects. And if you see here in the back, there's some of our staff members putting from the basket some of those shell into our restoration projects. So how the oyster gardeners take care, the only thing they need to actually do, oysters are pretty hardy and they love the hot water. So during the summer, when they're competing with algae, you just need to kind of flush them and keep them out of the bottom. And that's basically it. And our oyster gardeners love to know that they're doing something to give a head start to the oysters. So what we have learned at the beginning, we didn't even know if oysters could grow back into the inland base. So we have learned they can, and we have learned that you can kickstart the process and that you can have some natural recruitment. They enhance they have benefits of enhancing the habitats in the inland base. So they mean that they impact directly other species. And we just need enthusiastic citizens and people about it, and they understand the need of it and get involved with us, even if it's our restaurant partners or our volunteer oyster gardeners. In here, I just have a quick picture. You can see this is a demonstration tank that we use in some of our activities. And this is water from the bay. And we put the same water like an hour or two before in here. And the oysters, they start feeding on it and filtering. And you can actually see through, there's a door back there. You can see through the water in that side. So it's very easy to be an oyster gardener if anybody is interested. You just need to be able to lift the basket and have a water property front. And we normally work with individuals or with homeowners. And that is basically it. We have a donation membership, but it's to basically support the program because like Sarah mentioned, it is difficult to get some of the funding for these to support this type of project. And that's how we go back, and from oyster gardening we get, and this is where shell is being used. You can see that we use some of that cord, coconut cord fiber that I was talking about down here. And that's how we do our living shorelines and how we get involved and bring back that full cycle to a close. If anybody needs any information about our program, this is our website. You can contact us to here and contact our program assistant. And if you have any questions at any time, I will be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
That's awesome to you both. I just think that's such a great program, really fascinating, and really appreciate learning about the whole cycle and everything and how it all fits together. So definitely a circular system there. So it's great you're closing the loop. I guess there've been a couple, maybe we'll go first to the questions that were in the chat. I know Judy was asking, what about Phoebe's Fishery over on Lancaster Pike? Are they not participating, Sarah? It's a seafood restaurant over on Lancaster Pike.
Yeah. I think I feel I've reached out to just about every restaurant, and whether or not they reach back out and are interested in participating is a whole nother ball game. If you go to a place and you have you'll be like, hey, what happens to your shells? And they're like, oh, we throw them out. You'd be like, what about this recycling program? Like, please tell them, please let them know if they would reach out to me. I know some of them, I don't know about Phoebe's, but I think some of them are more markets too, and where people get their oysters. So they don't make a lot of the waste themselves. It's going home with people. And so that's why we opened up our public drop-off site. But if anyone, I'm always open to talking to more people who are interested. But these restaurant people are busy people. And it's a hard thing to get into with this new thing they have to do. They're very busy. So some restaurants are not as into it as others.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I think that's probably a question many of us here today have is, is there a way we can help to get more restaurants participating in one way or another? And so I guess we can all be ambassadors when we go out to dinner. Yeah, and at least put a bug in their ear about possibly joining the program or dropping off at George's or whatever.
Yep. And even for, we're open to other people getting other public drop-off places as well. If there was a market that wanted to do that instead, or something like that. So there's a lot of possibility, but of course, eat at the ones that do recycle too, if you're gonna go for it.
Exactly.
Okay. Just to add to that, in Sussex County, we try to ask people to contact us, even if it's like a home that bought a couple shells, because we have instances that people have tried to collect them like a bucket to bring it later for us, but they start stinking and they have half common. So we've been, and I imagine Sarah found that too in the city, it's tough to find a location when it's not gonna bother anyone to put all this shell. And ours is actually within a piece of land of state parks, and they rent it to us, so it's out in the woods and it doesn't bother anyone.
Okay, Richard put a question in the chat about, are there any commercial oyster farms involved or benefiting from these efforts? Great possibility for public-private NGO collaboration. I guess that's more about the raising of the oysters.
Yeah, so at least in the inland base, we have a commercial shellfish farming for oysters. We are involved with them when we communicate with them and we see them. The center has a lease within the area where they grow the shell, because our oysters need to spend at least a year on that lease in that water quality, which is one of the best in the inland base, before we can use them in our restoration projects. So we communicate with them, and sometimes they have done events where they have a lot of shell, and we've been there, collect the shells and start the process again. But I don't know if there's been any efforts beyond that. So that's a great question.
Know that in the bay, aquaculture, commercial aquaculture, it's fairly new. They just opened, only been on the Delaware side. New Jersey's a totally different story. And we haven't had direct contact with any of them, but we have been working with UD, who is researching like aquaculture things, and we do give our shell, they've bought shell from us, and so we're open to helping aquaculture as much as any other restoration, because it still does filters, all that filtering and all that good stuff. So we're open to it, but it hasn't really come up yet.
So I guess sort of as a corollary to that, Sally asked if the oyster gardeners transfer oysters to the open water, or do they just stay there for their entire lifetime and then get harvested from the garden?
Yes, so how it works is the oyster gardening assistant, he will go and pick up the shell from the year before and leave new spat with the oyster gardener. And then he will transport the 1-year-old oyster to the lease to grow there before being used on the restoration projects.
So they are moved a couple times then in their lifetimes.
Yes, it is basically moved based on guidance from the state on how they should be grown to make sure they are disease-free and that they are not accessible to people to consume, because these are not for consumption. And that's a big issue. It's like when our oyster gardeners sign from the program, they need to agree these are not for consumption.
I wanted to add that too. I think that was sometimes it is a cycle, but none of the oysters that we're recycling will ever be eaten again. They're only for restoration purposes, and they're usually put in unclean waters where you don't want to eat them, where they're being grown. So we use them purely restoration, and they will not be eaten again, or not supposed to be eaten again.
Okay. Does Sussex County have a public drop-off site, Nivette?
So the short answer is no, but if you contact me or Jim or James Tolley, he's our Don't Chuck Your Shucks pickup person, he will definitely, him or Andy, they are all shellfish program people. We will schedule you to pick it up, or the day when they are doing their rounds, if you live close to our actual shell pile, they can meet you down there. So we have done both. We have picked it up from people's houses, or we have met with them halfway point, depending what they are. Yep.
I don't know if both of you would maybe want to put your emails or phone numbers in the chat, and then everyone can access that easily. Let's see, Stitch asks if there are successful oyster volunteers on the canal.
Which canal? Like the South Bethany canals?
Stitch, are you out there? Can you unmute? There you go.
Yes. Hi. The Rehoboth Lewis Canal. So I'm on the canal about 10 doors north of the Rehoboth Avenue Bridge, the drawbridge. Are there successful programs there?
Okay, I will need to check the salinity of that area. The oysters need certain amount of salinity for some of our canals. I'm not sure on that one, what the salinity is. Sarah, do you know how saline the waters out there?
I know we have very successful on the Lewis Canal by the baseball fields. There's lots of oysters. We did a project there, but I'm not that great with my down there geography.
Yeah, so Lewis is an interesting area for us because it is just out of it, like in our watershed, but also have the Delaware Bay in top. So both watersheds kind of merge in there. And to put an example, I cannot grab some of the inland-based oysters and just throw them into Delaware Bay because they need to be tested for pathogens. I test them when I bring them in, but I will need to test them again to move them anywhere outside of the inland base. So Lewis, depending on where we're talking about, it will be either Sarah or me who will work with it. But it's been done. We've been working previously with UD, where they help us grow some oysters, and they were tested and they were introduced to the inland base. But the regulations for shellfish since the inception of the farming industry have been constantly changing, just to protect that product that actually people are consuming. Did that make sense, Sarah? Did I?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
The Nivette's email is in the chat. Stitch, if you want to follow up with her and see if it might work out for you there on the canal. See, Leslie says there's a family business near New Hope who farms oysters way up there. on the Delaware River. So that's pretty far up, isn't it? That would be, well, that's still in the estuary, I guess, right? New
Yeah,
Hope, is
right
that?
right on the edge for us.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I'd be interested in that, how they're doing oysters, or if they're doing it like in like man-made ponds, how they're getting salinity.
Leslie, feel free to unmute and chime in if you are out there.
Yes, I saw a presentation probably about 2 months ago from the fella who's the latest generation of this family oyster farm. And it's right near Lambertville and New Hope, just below those two places. I'd have to take some research and find out who they are. Go back if you're interested in knowing who they are. That's all I know.
That's fine. Yeah, I don't know. I say we're just in northern Delaware right now with the collections and all, but any oyster work that's going on in the area is interesting, and like I said, the salt, it's not so salty up there, so I would be interested what they're doing. Yeah.
I also, just a comment, I also added the Andrew Twarowski's email to the chat box. He's the current Don't Chuck Your Trucks driver or pickup guy. So I will, if you have any questions, I will say he will be my first, like, he knows what's going on, everything right now.
All right, and Judy asked if there's a logo. I'm pretty sure you both have logos for your programs, right? And do the restaurants, like if I went to one of your restaurants that are participating, would they maybe be using that logo on their menus and whatnot, so we would know? Yeah.
Sorry, you
Hopefully.
want to comment
Yeah.
first?
Yes, we do. We do provide all of that for them. We have table cards, tip cards. Some wanted posters. Along the lines, do they still have them? Do they ever ask me to give them more? Not all the time. So it's hit or miss, but we do provide all those things, and we hope they use them.
Same thing here. We have, we provide them with even like window clings, so they don't need to reprint their menus, like something that they can put in their window, or we provide them with coasters, a bunch of different kind of advertisement knickknacks. If they use them or not, that's up to them. We try for them to provide education resources for them to communicate what the program does to their staff. Some of them are better than others on following up with it, but yeah. If you need to find which restaurants are actually in the program, I would suggest to visit our website, and the list and the logos are there. And if you click on them, we normally have them linked to their website or their address or something.
And when you do go out to eat at those restaurants, be sure to thank them for participating and make sure they know we recognize their participation. So Sally asks if the diseases that wiped out the industry in the 1960s are under control now.
Interesting question.
I think things they're not as they're not like they were, but things are more regulated now, more monitored. There's a whole Delaware Bay like monitoring system that they do to try to monitor for the diseases, and then put in regulations if they're needed. Say different waters are off limits, those sort of things. But they're definitely they're not as bad as they were. I'll say that, I guess, at this moment. If that have anything else?
Yeah, sometimes we can be a little frustrated with the regulations, but in reality is to prevent the proliferation of those diseases, and all the larvae that comes into, for example, our oyster gardening program, we need to test it, send them to test in a laboratory to make sure that they're free of dermal, for example. And if they have any indications of it, we are not allowed to bring them into Delaware waters.
And Barbara asks where's Kent County in all of this? Is it just because maybe they don't have a lot of seafood restaurants concentrated? And so it's harder to make it an efficient program there.
Yeah, so that is our area, but as I think I mentioned at the beginning, the hardest part is finding a space to store your shells and the funding to do the collections at the same time. We actually were collecting from Dover Downs for a while, the oyster, pearl oyster, but they went out of business. There might be a new one there and open now, but I haven't got back to them. But we were there for a little while. But yes, also again, there was a time where we got some money from the state to try to investigate putting in Kent County, but I just got no interest from the restaurants, and we did not find a space to put them down there. So it's still in the back of our minds. We are right now starting up in Philly, which is the biggest market for oyster shell probably in our region, which is really what we want, kind of volume. So we're focusing on that right now, but hopefully in the future, we would love to have something in Kent County and in our kind of area of New Jersey. So maybe down the road. But also it is a bigger travel challenge with they're more spread out, things like that. So it is trickier.
Anna's wondering about the living shorelines and if they're specific to your programs. Make sure I'm reading this correctly. Or have you worked with other state agencies? I don't know. And I'm probably not capturing that right. I don't know if you want to unmute and try to ask your question. Can you guys see the chat?
I
Oh, there
see
she
it.
is.
So I work at the Department of Transportation, and we have a new program with the resiliency, and we are looking climate and resiliency, and I'm in the environmental section, so we're starting to look into protecting some of our roadways, like Port Mahon, where there's a lot of erosion and stuff, and putting in living shorelines. So I was just curious if the use of like what was shown in Nivette's photos, the wrapped oysters and that coconut fiber, if that was like specific to your programs, or if you have worked with other states agencies in order to do some mitigation needs along the state's coast.
For the living shoreline, to install living shorelines?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, and we do it often. We have worked with transportation, with DelDOT. We have worked with private and independent communities in our area. We have worked in collaboration with other agencies like PDE, or it all depends on what type of projects and what area it is, and the stakeholders for the area. But yes, the center works with all of them, and we normally bring a professional consultant that will design the living shoreline. We will first determine if a living shoreline will help the area, and then if it does, we will be part of the designing process. And if the shell is one of the best options for it, yes, we will definitely consider, and if the funding is available, everything comes. These are very complex projects that have a lot of moving parts, but yeah, if the coconut fiber and the shell is the best resource for mitigating a problem in a living shoreline, we will use them. As a nonprofit, we cannot sell the shell, so we partner, and that's our way of getting involved and we try to partner with other agencies that are bringing this material back into the waterways.
Yeah, same, we're a partnership is our first name, partnership for the Delaware Estuary. A lot of the national estuary programs are, and so really everything we do is with other organizations. We have worked with the state before. We are involved in those Port Mahon discussions that you were talking about. We've gone there and visited and involved with that. But lots of state projects. We work with the wetlands section a lot on projects, but also in all three states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. We have lots of partners, and we're, like I said, we will use our shell in anything that's restoration focused, whether it's our project or someone else's. we can get shell if it's needed.
So I just wanted to thank Nivette for mentioning that you are using those organic, biodegradable, compostable, coconut fibers, because, of course, from Plastic Free Delaware's perspective, we're trying to minimize the amount of plastic that goes into the marine environment. So I think that's a great development that you've made that transition, or are in the process of making that transition. That's great. And I just quickly looked up, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this website that DENREC has called recyclopedia.org, I think. And it's sort of the go-to place for if you don't know if something's recyclable or where to take it. Obviously, it has things that can go on your curbside, but it also lists all kinds of other things that you can recycle in other ways. And it's the entity that recycles it has to go on and get listed. So I would just encourage you guys to go on to I can send you the link, recyclopedia.org, and list the public drop-off sites, in Nivette if and when you have one, so that, just to get the word out there that this is a possibility, so we can do more to help you get even more shells and keep them out of the landfill.
Something I want to mention is the word that you use, minimizing the plastic, is kind of like the tricky part, because yes, the coconut fiber, if we can use it, we will use it, but there are certain limitations depending. For example, if it's a living shoreline where there is a lot of wave action, it will break the bags in less than a week or two. So the other bags actually are more resistant, and it will hold in place the project, and you don't want to do a living shoreline and then it washes all away.
Yeah,
so
I know.
We are looking, and this is a topic that is being discussed by many different agencies and different researchers looking for better ways. Shell is one of our preferred, because it was the natural habitat in our environment in Delaware. But other entities are using other type of structures that kind of mimic better, some made of concrete, some made of stone. So it all depends on what we can use and what mimics the better what was natural for our area.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that, we also are always looking for we'll do whatever bags, if it's not our project, whatever bags someone wants, we'll use. There are biodegradable, potato starch, there's lots of other options. But it always depends on your goals for the project, because some of that coconut fiber is probably not going to recruit oysters as much as the more open plastic bags. So it depends on really what your goals are for the project, what kind of bag you need. But we're open to all options depending on the project that's going on.
I just had to say that, since we are Plastic Free Delaware.
And we agree, and I totally agree. I want it to be plastic as little as possible.
Right, I understand. So always in search of perfection, but I know we live in the real world. So I guess the only other question I was wondering about is if you guys could touch on where your funding comes from. I know you kind of had startup funding, and you touched on sort of how you keep it going now, but are there maybe consistent funders, or I don't know, maybe there's funders that will end up listening to this that might be interested, donors. I guess I just partly wondered, does DSWA help support you, or other agencies?
No, that would be great. Honestly, I think that is it's hard to be running a program and thinking of all these things at the same time. We did have startup funding. We did have different welfare foundation really started our Delaware program. We've had this wetlands program has supported us through funding currently. I don't like to say we do quote unquote sell it, but it just goes back. It's really just a direct cost. So if someone else wants a shell, they pay us for it, but it just goes back to support the program. And at this point, that is sustaining our Delaware pickups, just the amount of shell we're making. And we also, our own projects will also buy it from other funds. So all the other projects that are differently funded can also help support the shell if they're using shell. In Philadelphia right now, we're starting up, and we got startup funds from the state there to start in Philadelphia, but a lot of funders don't like these right? We're just continuing, right? They're big on startup funds. They're big on the big push, at the beginning, but then they're like, oh, you're just doing the same thing year after year. I'm like, well, it's still good stuff. So that is trickier to find. So we've been focusing on our Philly efforts most recently, but our Delaware has kind of been able to sustain itself. It's like right on the edge. But we hope we'll, as things come, we're always looking for new opportunities.
In our case, it's kind of very similar, and one of, like, probably for Sarah is the same. One of the biggest expenses is a designated staff member, even if he's part-time, to do the runs and pick up the shell. It's a tough job. It's cold and hot in the winter. It is sweaty, the shell stinks. It is difficult to find someone who want to do it, and difficult to find funding to support staff hours. So some of our funding comes from our main funders of EPA and DEMREC, but also we have funders like private donations, people that donate to the center and say, hey, I want this to go directly to the Don't Show Your Truck program. And that's why we are always very grateful to our donors and our funders, because it comes sometimes from a person, like an individual that is like, hey, I want to support. And sometimes they learn about the program through the restaurants, and that's how they come to support us. But yeah, it is a tricky one, like Sarah said, because it's ongoing. And if it's not like a startup, or you're not bringing something new to it, it's just to keep up that process. The sources for funding kind of like they close very quickly.
All right. Well, I think we're at our lunch hour end, and from the comments I can see in the chat, hopefully you've seen them. I think everyone's really enjoyed learning about all of this and enjoyed your talk. So thank you very much to Nivette and Sarah for doing this for us today. And I'll send you the recording when it's done, and hopefully we can all share it more widely, and we can all now be ambassadors to get you even more shells. All right. Any other quick comments from anyone? Unmute and chime in if you'd like. Otherwise, I'll wish you a good afternoon, and we'll call it a day. All right.
Thank you for
All right. Well,
inviting
thank you,
me.
everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank
Take
you
care.
all.